And the Creator made man, and by his side woman, father and mother of us all. He gave them a choice. Follow the temptation of darkness, or hold on to the blessing of light. But they ate from the forbidden fruit. Their innocence is extinguished. And so for the 10 generations since Adam, sin has walked within us. Brother against brother. Nation against nation. Man against creation. We murdered each other. We broke the world. We did this. Man did this. Everything that was beautiful, everything that was good, we shattered. Now, it begins again.
So we're going to continue this week, part 2 of our series. If you were here last week, we talked about creation, the very first creation, the beginning of creation. We talked about the poem, this beautiful poem of creation that the writer of Genesis kind of gives us. We talked about the 3 days where God creates the realms. He creates the night, the day, he creates the sea, the air, and then he creates the land. And then the next 3 days, he creates all the rulers of the realms. He creates the stars, the sun, the moon. He creates the birds. He creates the fish. He creates the animals. And then he creates man. And what's really interesting about that creation story and about the history of all of that is that in Judaism in ancient times, they believed that numbers held a lot of power. They held a lot of meaning. And for a Jewish person in that time, the number 3 was a number of completion. And so it's just very interesting that we have God creating these realms in 3 days, which is a time of completion, and then we have him creating the rulers of these 3 days, which is also a time of completion. And as you can see from the video, and again, if you know the story, we kind of really messed it all up. We screwed it all up. And that video is actually from last weekend. This week is from the Noah movie. I've never seen the movie, so I don't necessarily endorse it. I just like the clip, and it kind of talked about where we're going, so don't go tell people I'm endorsing the movie because I haven't seen it, but I like that clip. So, I don't want people getting me on Facebook saying, well, my pastor said it's a good movie, because I don't know. But for this week, I want to talk a little bit about what happened after that. What happened after that time? So I kind of have a couple questions for you. So for those of you in the room who have kids, do your kids, whenever you ask them to do something, whenever you talk to them, do your kids listen every time? Your kids are perfect, right? They listen to you, they obey everything you say. Just no questions asked. You say, go do this, and it's done, right? Our kids are perfect. I know mine aren't. Well, let me ask you this. What about if you were to ask your kids something and they say, well, I promise I'm going to do that. Do your kids keep all their promises to you? You have to look at them. We'll go even deeper. Do you always keep your promises? When you give a promise to somebody, whether it's to a child, to your kid, to your friend, to your neighbor, and you say, I promise I'm going to do this, do you always keep that promise? Sometimes we have excuses we have for why we don't keep the promises. Sometimes we just forget. Well, what's interesting is, if you think about it, why do we act this way? Why do we miss these promises? Why do our kids not listen? Why do they not obey us? Well, and the answer is because that's how we're made. Now, we were made this way because of the fall of man. It started in the garden, and it's continued on through history. Now, I don't want you to get that confused and think that God makes us this way, because we know from the first story that God made creation perfect. He made it good. He made humanity the way he wanted it. But when we had that sin and we had that fall, that curse came onto humanity. So now every person that is born under that curse, was born under that sin. And they live by their own flesh. We don't want to look and say, well, God made me this way. That's why I act this way. Because God didn't. He made us all good. But it's the curse of sin that has caused us to act this way. And in the garden, what's interesting is the way in which it all happened. Because when God created Adam and Eve, he gave them basically two rules. Don't eat from the tree of knowledge and don't eat from the tree of life. And they, as we may know, were deceived. And what's interesting is who they were deceived by. Most likely, the person that deceived them was probably someone who was familiar to them. Because when they walked in the garden, God was with them, angels were with them. And it is very possible that the serpent, the demon, was somebody that they had maybe come in contact with before. So when they were deceived, it wasn't something that they were intentionally doing. They just thought that they were doing something good. They thought they were going to become more like God, and that must be what God wants, is for us to be more like him. But what happened was, they became a slave to their desire. They became a slave to their flesh. They became a slave to the wants and the needs of me, which is what we still live with today. But as you can see from the video, and this happened pretty fast after God created the world in this fall, God got a little fed up with everybody. You know, I kind of see God up in heaven just kind of, facepalm, like, did I really just do this? And I know he didn't. That's just kind of how I like to see it. I kind of like to see God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit, and they're kind of like, whose idea was that? Because they're messed up down there. And it was only 5 generations after the creation, after Adam, 5 generations, that we get Noah. And in Genesis 6, 7 and 8, it says, "So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I made them." So just 5 generations into his creation, God says, I'm sorry I made all of it because of what has happened. There's a but that comes after that. And it says, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. One man found favor in the eyes of the Lord, of all humanity. And so, if you know the story of Noah's ark, we know that God went to Noah and God said, I'm going to flood the world. I'm going to destroy this creation with a flood. And I want you and your family to be rescued. I want the animals to be rescued. Because with the favor I found in you, I don't want to destroy everything. I just want to start over. And when the flood was gone, and they come back out on the dry land, Noah, he sets forth an offering to God. And in that offering, this is in Genesis 8, verse 21, it says, "And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from youth." So what God's saying here is, I understand that they're born into this. Their heart is evil from youth. Another way that word youth can actually be translated as childhood or child. So he's saying, I'm not going to keep blaming them because they start this from youth. They start this from birth. They start this from the beginning. And when he started over with Noah, he didn't redo creation. He didn't start this new perfect world. He just started over into what we have as the fallen world. But he makes a promise to Noah. He makes a promise to all of humanity that I will never destroy the earth or curse the earth in this way again, even though I know what you're like. I know your humanity. I know your flesh. I will never do that again. And a few generations later from Noah, we have a man named Abraham. He's actually the fourth generation from Noah. What's interesting, so you have Adam. Noah's in the line of Adam. Abraham's in the line of Noah. They're all family. They're all from one family. So Noah's the fourth generation or Abraham's the fourth generation of Noah. And Abraham was also a man that God found favor in. And God meets with Abraham and he makes him a promise. Now, to give you a little story, a little history of Abraham, Abraham was old. He was 100 years old. His wife was old. And God makes a promise to them that to them is just unbelievable. And it says in Genesis 17, verse 7, "And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring. After you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you." So what God's doing here, he restarted humanity with Noah. So Noah is the father of all of humanity. They expand, they grow, they get bigger. The world starts to populate again. And he finds Abraham. And he says, I'm going to take you and I'm going to choose my people from you. Now, Abraham didn't have any children. Abraham, like I said, was over 100 years old, and his wife was right there with him. And this was something that was unbelievable to Abraham. Why are you saying these things to me? You're going to give me children. You're going to give me more children than the stars in the sky, is what God says to him. But what God's doing is he's saying, I'm going to take you and your family, and you're going to be my people. I'm not going to try to do all this with the rest of humanity. I'm going to take you and your family, and I'm going to expand you, and you're going to become my people. And he makes that promise to Abraham. Because what he's doing is he's starting the process of an even greater plan. So again, with Adam was the father of all humanity. Then you had Noah, who once again was the father of all humanity. Now you have Abraham, who is the father of God's people. And God's starting this plan. And what's so amazing about this plan was already thought of before God created anything. So take a moment to think about that. Before God created everything and said that it was good, he already knew what was going to happen. He already knew what he was going to have to do. He already knew that everything in humanity was going to go the way it's going. And he still did it. He still said, I'm going to create that, even though I know exactly what's going to happen, and I know what's going to happen. And as we talked about last week, we know that when he created this world, when he created everything here, he created it because he wanted us. He wanted a relationship with us. He wanted nothing more than that. And to think he knowingly created everything, knowing that we didn't want, or at times would not want a relationship with him. And what it would take to give us that relationship. So from Abraham, you have Abraham's lineage, which becomes the Jewish nation, or Israel. And you have the 12 tribes of Israel. And I know I'm moving through a lot of information in the Old Testament, but I want to get to this next promise that God makes, because this is really where we're going to hit home today. So out of the line of Abraham, you go 13 generations, and you have a young boy named David. You may have heard the story of David and Goliath. Well, David was anointed to be the king of all of Israel. He didn't come from a line of kings. He didn't come from royalty. He was a shepherd. And God anointed him to be the king of Israel. Because God is still working on this plan. He's still working on this promise for all of us, for all of creation, for all of humanity. And when David becomes king, he has a prophet by the name of Nathan. who comes to him, and he gives him a promise that God gave to him. And that promise is found in 2 Samuel. And it's on chapter 7, verses 12 through 16. I'm going to talk through a little bit of this while I'm reading it. It says, "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom." And what he's actually talking about right there is David's son Solomon. So the next king after David is Solomon. So God is saying, your son Solomon, I'm going to raise him up, and he's going to be the next king. Because this is where it starts to get important. "He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you." So Saul was the king before David. Saul did not like David. He was going after David for many, many, many years. Most of the Psalms are written about David's time in hiding from Saul. And so God makes this promise with David and says, your son Solomon is going to raise up and be the king, and he's going to build my house. He's going to build the temple of God, which is where God comes to dwell. And the last part of this verse 16, is where it gets really interesting, because he says, "And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." Now, when we read this, if we know anything about the New Testament, we know that this prophecy is talking about Jesus. We know that Jesus is going to come from the line of David. And we know that that's the everlasting kingdom that God is talking about. But if you were a person in that time, if you were a Jew in that time and you're reading this, you have no idea what this is talking about. And really, in that time, the Jews, what they believed is that God was going to raise up another king. They thought he was going to raise up another David. They thought he was going to raise up this warrior who was going to save them from all their adversaries and start his rule back with Israel for all eternity. But what I think is so interesting is these promises. Because as we talked about, when we make a promise, we don't always keep it. But when God makes a promise, he's going to keep it. And he keeps it every time. And with the promise that he made to David, it wasn't a promise that anyone expected. They weren't expecting what was to come. Like I said, they were looking for a ruler, they were looking for a king. But what they got was something so much greater. But if you read the prophecies of the Old Testament, from the mindset of someone in that time, it just kind of seems like a jumbled mess. And that's why it's so important to understand when God made the promise, why he did it in such a way that he did. Why when he made the prophecies, when he made this promise, he did it in such a way that people didn't know what he was talking about. And that's for next week. We're going to talk about, why did God keep it hidden? Why did God keep it secret? But today, I really want to focus on these promises that God's making, because as we look through the story of creation, as we look through these beginnings, we see a God who creates everything. He makes it good. He makes it for us. He makes it for love of us, for relationship with us. He knows we're going to screw it up. He knows we're going to mess it up. So he starts it over. And he knows we're going to mess it up again. So he sends someone and says, I'm going to start my people through you. And he knows they're going to screw it up again. And he says, well, I'm going to do something else. Why? Because he knows they're going to screw it up again too. God knows we're going to screw up. He's planned for us to screw up. But he's made us a promise. And that promise is what we hold on to. That promise is the thing that we look to when we say, God, I screwed up. But I know you promised something to me. You put a promise in front of me that you will not take away, that you will fulfill. And that promise is the hope that we have to keep going. And if you get nothing else out of this message, that's what I want you to hear. That God has established a promise with each of us. He has established a promise to create that relationship with us. He has given that promise that even though you are going to have times where you mess up, or you screw up, where you don't do what you say you're going to do, I will. I will. And that's the one thing out of anything else we can count on, is that He will. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we just come before you today. We know we are not worthy for what you have given us. We know so many times that we stumble, that we fall, that we may not even know what we're doing, that we're acting out of our flesh, out of our desire. But we just thank you for the promise that you have given us, the hope that you have given us, that you are still there, that you still are waiting for us to come back, that you want nothing more than that relationship with us, and you will wait for us, Lord. And we just thank you for your promise, Lord. In your name we pray.